Love isn't supposed to feel this hollow, Mia thought, staring at the window as the winter wind howled outside. The soft hum of the heater was the only sound in the dimly lit room, yet it couldn't warm the emptiness inside her. She had been married to Daniel for 7 years now. Once, their love had been effortless, full of laughter, surprises, and whispered confessions in the dark. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The warmth had faded, leaving behind a routine that felt more like an obligation than a partnership. That morning had been no different. Daniel had rushed out of the house, barely kissing her on the cheek before grabbing his briefcase. Mia had stood at the door, watching his car disappear into the street, feeling an ache she couldn't name. Another day, another silence, she muttered, shutting the door and pressing her back against it. The loneliness was louder than ever. She tried to push the feeling away, distracting herself with chores. By afternoon, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. She sat on the couch, a book in her lap that she wasn't really reading, her mind drifting elsewhere. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on the staircase. "Hey, Mia," a voice called, casual yet comforting. She turned to see Ethan, Daniel's 24-year-old cousin, who had been staying with them temporarily. "Didn't expect you to be home," she said, setting her mug down. Ethan shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "Classes were canceled. Figured I'd catch up on some reading." Mia nodded, watching him as he walked further into the room. His presence was different from Daniel's, lighter, easier. "You're working on your research paper, right?" she asked. A small grin played on Ethan's lips. "Yeah, it's been consuming my life. But I like a challenge. Something about solving a puzzle keeps me hooked." His words lingered in the air, and for some reason, so did the way he looked at her. Not intrusive, not demanding, just present. Attentive. Mia shifted, pushing the feeling away. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know." "Will do," Ethan said, his voice softer now. As he walked away, Mia caught herself staring after him, her thoughts betraying her logic. That night, she lay in bed beside Daniel, listening to his even breaths as he slept. She should have felt comforted by his presence, but all she felt was the weight of the silence between them. And for the first time in a long time, her mind wasn't on her husband. The next morning began like any other. Except, for Mia, it wasn't. She stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into Daniel's favorite mug, but her mind was elsewhere. She had barely slept, her thoughts tangled in the quiet moments from the night before. She had told herself that it was nothing, that the lingering awareness of Ethan's presence was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew better. Daniel entered the kitchen, already dressed for work, his eyes glued to his phone as he typed something furiously. Mia placed his coffee in front of him. "Thanks," he muttered, barely glancing up. She forced a small smile, even though he wasn't looking. "Long day ahead?" "Yeah, meetings back to back." He took a sip of coffee and frowned. "Did you change the brand?" Mia blinked. "No, it's the same one we always get." He set the mug down, unimpressed, and returned to his phone. Mia sat across from him, watching him for a moment. There had been a time when mornings were filled with conversation. When Daniel would steal kisses between bites of toast. When they'd laugh about something meaningless but shared. Now, they just coexisted. The sound of footsteps coming down the stairs broke the silence. "Morning," Ethan greeted, his voice bright, cutting through the monotony. He strolled into the kitchen, running a hand through his messy dark hair, still half asleep but somehow more present than Daniel had been all morning. "Morning, Ethan," Mia said, her tone warmer than she'd expected. Daniel barely lifted his gaze from his screen. Morning, he murmured. Ethan grabbed a plate and slid into the chair next to her. His energy was a stark contrast to Daniel's distracted demeanor. So, what's on the agenda for you today? Ethan asked, taking a bite of toast. Same as always, Mia replied with a small shrug. Chores, errands, making sure this place doesn't fall apart. Ethan smirked. That's a full-time job. You deserve a raise. Mia laughed lightly. It was such a simple comment, meant in jest, but something about it made her stomach flutter. Daniel sighed, standing up and grabbing his bag. All right, I've gotta go. See you tonight. Mia nodded. Have a good day. Daniel leaned down, gave her a quick, absent-minded kiss on the top of her head, then left without another word. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to Mia, his expression unreadable. He's always in a rush, huh? Mia let out a soft sigh. Yeah, work keeps him busy. Ethan nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair. Well, if you need a break from all those chores, let me know. I'm happy to help. She smiled, shaking her head. I don't want to bother you. You've got your studies. He shrugged. I don't mind. The way he said it, so easy, so natural, made something tighten in her chest. She looked down at her coffee, suddenly feeling too aware of the space between them. This was nothing. It had to be nothing. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched across the house, pressing against Mia's thoughts. She busied herself with chores, folding laundry in the living room while the faint sound of birds chirping outside filtered in through the open window. It was peaceful, in a way, but not the kind of peace that felt fulfilling. More like a pause, an empty space between moments. She was halfway through folding a towel when she heard footsteps. Need a hand? She turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, a lazy grin on his face. He was holding a book in one hand, his other shoved into the pocket of his jeans. Mia shook her head with a small smile. You don't have to help. I've got it covered. He stepped further into the room anyway. I don't mind. She watched as he grabbed a towel from the pile and began folding it, awkwardly, like he had never done laundry a day in his life. Mia chuckled. That's definitely not how you fold a towel. Ethan looked down at his messy attempt and laughed. All right, teach me, laundry expert. She reached out, taking the towel from his hands, and their fingers brushed for just a second. Barely a touch, but enough to make her breath catch. Ethan didn't move, his eyes flicking to hers for a fraction of a second before he cleared his throat and stepped back. So, he said, trying to sound casual. You've been with Daniel for what, 7 years? Yeah, Mia said, focusing on the towel in her hands. Married for 5. Ethan nodded, watching her closely. That's a long time. It is. She let out a small sigh. It goes by fast. Still feels like it did in the beginning? The question was innocent, but it hit harder than it should have. Mia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the fabric. I don't know, she admitted softly. Sometimes I think about that. Ethan didn't say anything right away. Instead, he sat down on the couch, stretching his legs out in front of him. I get it. My parents were married for years, but I don't think they were ever really together, you know? She met his gaze, surprised by the honesty in his voice. He shrugged. They loved each other, sure, but there was always this distance, like they were living 2 different lives under the same roof. Mia exhaled, the words settling over her like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. Distance. She felt it every day. With Daniel. With herself. With the version of her life she had once imagined. Yeah, she murmured. I know what you mean. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Then Ethan broke the silence with a small, teasing grin. So, You gonna teach me how to fold this? Or am I a lost cause? Mia laughed, shaking her head. All right, watch and learn. And just like that, the tension eased. But even as they laughed over badly folded towels, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something that couldn't be ignored. The following days slipped into routine, except, now, Mia was noticing things she hadn't before. The way Ethan's presence filled the spaces Daniel left empty. The way he lingered in the kitchen while she cooked, asking about her day. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. And yet, when Daniel came home late that evening, exhausted from work and barely acknowledging her before disappearing into his home office, Mia felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The silence. The absence. She had finished dinner alone at the dining table, washing the dishes in the dim kitchen light, when she heard footsteps behind her. You shouldn't have to eat alone. She turned to see Ethan leaning against the doorframe, hands in his pockets. Mia let out a quiet chuckle, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I'm used to it. That doesn't mean it's right. She sighed, glancing toward the closed door of Daniel's office. She could hear the faint tapping of his keyboard, the occasional low murmur of his voice on a call. Work, as always. She shook her head, offering Ethan a tired smile. It's just life. Ethan watched her for a moment, then stepped further into the kitchen. You know, you don't have to pretend with me. Mia frowned slightly. What do you mean? He leaned against the counter, studying her like he was trying to figure out how much he could say without pushing too far. I mean, I see how much you do. How much you hold everything together. She exhaled, turning back to the sink. That's what marriage is, Ethan. You give. You take care of things. Even when it feels like you're the only one trying. Her hands stilled on the dish she was scrubbing. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had spent so long convincing herself that this was normal. That the silence, the distance, the loneliness, it was just a phase. A part of marriage that she had to push through. But when had pushing through turned into accepting? Ethan's voice was softer now. I just don't think you should have to carry everything on your own. Mia swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. The kindness in his voice felt too much, too close. She turned to face him, forcing a small smile. You're sweet, Ethan, but it's complicated. His lips curved slightly, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. I know. I'm not trying to make things harder for you. For a second, they just stood there, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Then Ethan pushed off the counter. Come on, he said lightly. You've had a long day. Let's sit for a bit. Mia hesitated but followed him to the living room, sinking into the couch as he sat beside her. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty this time. It wasn't suffocating. And maybe that was the most dangerous part of all. The rain started late that night. A soft drizzle at first, then heavier, tapping against the windows in rhythmic beats. Mia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the storm. Daniel was beside her, already asleep, his back turned to her as always. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin, but sleep didn't come. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying Ethan's words. You don't have to carry everything on your own. It had been years since someone had said something like that to her. Years since she had felt seen. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to push the thought away. This was dangerous. Whatever this was, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. She was just lonely. That's all it was. Mia sat up, rubbing her hands over her face. She needed some air. Carefully, she slipped out of bed, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake Daniel. She padded down the stairs, the wooden floor cool beneath her bare feet. The house was dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp outside, casting faint shadows on the walls. She made her way to the kitchen, reaching for the kettle. A cup of tea would help. Maybe. But before she could turn it on, a voice startled her. "Can't sleep?" She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hair slightly messy, his hoodie loose over his frame. Mia exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. "You scared me." He gave her a small, apologetic smile. "Sorry, I couldn't sleep either." She hesitated, then nodded toward the table. "Want some tea?" Ethan stepped forward, sitting across from her as she made 2 cups. The silence between them was comfortable, easy. When she slid his cup toward him, his fingers brushed against hers, just for a second. A fleeting touch, but it was enough. She pulled her hand away quickly, gripping her own mug tightly. Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, softly, he said, "You're different when he's not around." Mia's breath hitched. She looked up at him, heart pounding. "Ethan!" "I'm not trying to make things complicated," he said quickly, his voice quiet but firm. I notice things." She swallowed hard, staring down at her tea. "It's late. We should go back to bed." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, probably." Neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Mia stood first, gripping the edge of the table as if steadying herself. "Good night, Ethan." He watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good night, Mia." She turned, walking away before she could let herself think. But as she climbed the stairs, she knew this wasn't nothing, and that terrified her. The storm carried into the next evening, the wind howling against the windows as rain lashed against the glass. The house felt quieter than usual, the kind of stillness that made everything feel heavier. Daniel had called earlier. Another late night at the office. Another excuse. Mia wasn't surprised. She had stopped feeling disappointed a long time ago. She sat curled up on the couch, a book in her lap that she wasn't really reading. The words blurred together, her thoughts elsewhere. Then, footsteps. She looked up just as Ethan appeared in the doorway, his presence both familiar and unsettling. He held a blanket in one hand, a steaming mug in the other. "You looked cold," he said simply, walking over and draping the blanket over her shoulders before sitting beside her. Mia swallowed, gripping the fabric tightly. "Thanks." Ethan didn't say anything right away. He just sipped his tea, his eyes flicking toward the window, watching the storm. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft but weighted. Mia's stomach tightened. "Leaving?" He turned to her. "Yeah, just packing up, starting over somewhere new." She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Where would I even go?" Ethan shrugged. "Anywhere. Somewhere that makes you happy." Mia stared at him, feeling something deep in her chest tighten. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" She exhaled, shaking her head. "Because this is my life, Ethan. I made choices. I have responsibilities." Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "But are you happy?" The question hit her harder than it should have. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Ethan set his mug down on the coffee table, leaning forward slightly. "Mia, I—" A loud crack of thunder made her jump, and without thinking, she grabbed his arm. It was instinct, a reflex. But the second she felt the warmth of his skin under her fingertips, everything changed. She met his eyes, her breath catching. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The air between them felt electric, charged with something undeniable. Ethan's gaze flickered down to where her hand rested on his arm. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his hand, brushing his fingers over hers. Mia's heart pounded. This was wrong. This shouldn't be happening. And yet, she didn't pull away. Not until the sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway shattered whatever moment had just existed between them. Mia yanked her hand back as if burned, standing up quickly. I need to go to bed. Ethan didn't stop her. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. As she hurried up the stairs, her hands trembling, one thought echoed in her mind. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back now. Mia barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel had come home, exhausted as always, muttering something about work before collapsing into bed. He hadn't noticed her silence. Hadn't noticed the way her hands trembled when she folded the blankets. Hadn't noticed the storm raging inside her. Her mind kept replaying that moment in the living room. Ethan's touch, the way his fingers had lingered just a second too long. The way her heart had pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. And worse, the way she hadn't wanted to pull away. By morning, her exhaustion felt heavier than ever. She went through the motions, making coffee, preparing breakfast, setting the table. Daniel walked into the kitchen, scrolling through his phone. "Morning," he muttered, not looking up. Mia forced a smile. "Morning." She waited. Waited for him to ask how she slept. Waited for him to notice anything at all. But he just took his coffee and sat down, his attention elsewhere. The chair across from her scraped against the floor, and she looked up to see Ethan taking a seat. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Mia's breath caught, but she quickly looked away. "Morning, Ethan," Daniel said, not even glancing up. "Morning," Ethan replied, his voice steady. Mia could feel his gaze on her, but she refused to meet it. Daniel scrolled through his emails, sipping his coffee absent-mindedly. "I might have to stay late again tonight," he said. "Don't wait up for me." Mia just nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. Ethan cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. "You work late a lot, huh?" Daniel shrugged. "Comes with the job." Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he set his coffee cup down, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim. "Must be tough," he said casually. "Balancing work and, everything else?" Mia's fingers tightened around her spoon. Daniel barely reacted. "It's fine. Mia understands." "Does she?" She almost laughed at the thought. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, she's pretty understanding." Mia swallowed hard, the weight of the words pressing against her chest. Daniel's phone buzzed and he stood up, already distracted again. "I have to take this," he said, grabbing his bag. "See you later." He kissed Mia on the cheek, barely a touch, before walking out the door. The silence he left behind felt suffocating. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Wow." Mia stared at the coffee in her mug. "Don't." Ethan frowned. "Don't what?" "Don't make this something it's not." Ethan scoffed. "Mia, come on. You're not okay." "I'm fine." He shook his head. "No, you're not." Mia's hands clenched into fists. "What do you want me to say, Ethan? That I feel invisible? That I don't even remember the last time Daniel really looked at me?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I just want you to stop pretending." Mia let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how." The silence between them was thick, heavy with everything they weren't saying. And for the first time, Mia wondered if she even wanted to. The house felt different that evening. Heavier. Charged. Mia had spent the entire day trying to act normal, washing dishes, answering emails, folding laundry. but nothing felt the same. Everything had shifted, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Daniel hadn't called, hadn't checked in, hadn't even sent a text to let her know when he'd be home. But that wasn't new. She sat on the couch, staring at the television, but the show playing on the screen was just background noise. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Ethan walked in, pausing in the doorway when he saw her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Mia didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to. Ethan sighed, stepping forward. "Mia." She shook her head. "I don't know what to do anymore." He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not touching. "Not yet." "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said gently. Mia let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "It's not just tonight, Ethan. It's every night. Every morning. Every single day that I wake up and realize that I'm just here." Ethan's eyes darkened. "You deserve more than that." She swallowed hard, blinking quickly as a lump rose in her throat. "I don't even know what more looks like anymore." Ethan hesitated, then reached out slowly, carefully, as if giving her a chance to pull away. She didn't. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative at first, then firmer, his grip warm and steady. Mia's breath hitched. This was wrong. And yet, when she looked up at him, when she saw the way he was looking at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. She felt seen. Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me to stop." Mia's pulse pounded in her ears. She should. She had every reason to. But she couldn't. She didn't move. Didn't speak. And then, the sound of the front door unlocking sent her scrambling back, her heart slamming against her ribs. Ethan pulled away instantly, running a hand through his hair as if trying to steady himself. The door swung open. Daniel walked in, his expression tired, his eyes scanning the room. "Hey," he muttered, setting his bag down. Mia forced a breath, her hands still trembling. "Hey." Daniel glanced at her, then at Ethan, his brow furrowing slightly. "Everything okay?" Mia nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just watching TV." Daniel barely reacted. "All right, I'm gonna shower." And just like that, he was gone again. Mia let out a shaky breath, turning back to Ethan. He was already watching her, his expression unreadable. She swallowed hard, the reality of what had almost happened settling in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. The line hadn't just blurred, it had nearly disappeared. And for the first time, she didn't know if she wanted to bring it back.